Hey, how's it going? This video is a deeper dive into one of my favorite plugins, the Kramer HLS from Waves. This is kind of an old plugin. It's been around for ages. Yeah, I think it's kind of overlooked in some ways because maybe it's not your standard EQ in terms of how it works. The settings require a little bit of a learning curve, and some getting used to. But once you figured it out, it can be an extremely powerful EQ, and it sounds really musical and really useful in many situations. So let's dive in. So, one of the first things I like to look at is the impedance selector. In the real version of this preamp EQ, it's basically switching between a line and a mic um, input. And when you select mic, the first thing you'll notice is that you're immediately getting some high frequency shelf, giving you a gentle but fairly broad boost. And this can be extremely useful for overhead mics, acoustic instruments, and so on. It's quite musical and not as aggressive as it might seem. Already, right off the bat, with the default setup, we're getting a small amount of low end roll off and some treble boost, very minimal, but still enough to give you a sense of clarity right off the bat, which can make a big difference. For example, on a bass track that it's kind of subby or muddy. The fact that this is a preamp emulation means that it brings in some harmonic distortion right away. You can't really turn it off in this plugin, but it's really subtle, at least at the most moderate settings. So it actually gives more of that feeling of clarity when it's not really pushed. Even at the highest settings, you can't really drive this thing too much. It still stays quite restrained. The bass section is one of the most powerful on this plugin, and it's also one of the most misunderstood because it's kind of set up in a really bizarre configuration. So, if you select 60 hertz, you see that you're already getting an enormous shelf boost. And this is not just like boosting 60 hertz, it's boosting basically anything from about 1,000 to 20 hertz, and you're getting about 2 dB, 3 dB, almost 2 dB boost, like right off the bat, without even cranking it up. You can also crank it up and get more of that boost. It's a very, very broad shelf, and this is very musical. You know, the older EQ designs are kind of often designed with this kind of configuration in mind, providing really broad shelves. This was a way to minimize phase shift in the EQs because at the time there wasn't much of multi-tracking or things like that. You know, people tended to EQ groups or entire mixes a lot more. And so they didn't want to really change the frequency, the phase relationship between the frequencies too much and try to preserve that kind of interaction between all the frequencies as much as they could. As a result, you're getting something that's more like a tonal shape thing rather than a very surgical EQ. And it can be extremely useful to beef up a sound that doesn't have a lot of low end. So the higher you go, the more this like shelf is starting to look like a bell. It's still broad, but the focus changes and it becomes narrower the higher the frequencies. If we get to the negative side of the knob, we're starting to get the low cut, which again is very, it's a very broad slope. I'm guessing it's about 6 dB or something, 3 dB. This is probably the slope numbers. And again, very gentle. So you don't really have any like brick wall type filtering. They're gentle slopes that are great for tone shaping, but they eat up in the material quite a lot. For example, now we're cutting well into the mid range and not just the low end. So they're really powerful tool if you understand how to use them correctly. They're not really for cutting just the lows, they're just generally for tone shaping. For instance, um, you could totally do something like this to create a nice scooped sound on a bass drum that works really well because it's going to beef up a lot of the low end, give you some attack. You can maybe use this configuration to add more clarity to an acoustic guitar where you get a little bit of treble boost and clean up some of the low end. So many potential applications. Another interesting aspect of this EQ is the high frequency knob. This is stepped. So this means you cannot select in between values. You can only select 4, 12, 8, and so on. And again, we're getting a fairly broad shelf. Again, great for general tone shaping. It can sound quite aggressive, especially at higher settings where the shelf gets kind of steeper and steeper. And it kind of adds a little bit of mid range as well. So this really tends to sound aggressive, and it can sound really good on room microphones that are quite dark and really need to be brightened a little bit or more presence is needed. You can also use negative values and it becomes almost like a gentle roll off of the highs. The shape is slightly different from the positive values. We also have the mid-range knob, which works differently. A lot of the times I just see people moving this and not understanding that you're actually not going to get anything. You need to use this knob in conjunction with this knob, which has two different settings. PK is for boosting and TR is for cutting. When you select TR, you're just going to lose generally a little bit of level. You lose about 1 dB. But then you can select your frequency and cut a bell. And basically, the more you cut, the narrower the shape of the bell gets. So again, quite useful for tone shaping, not very surgical, but very musical in the way it's set up. For boosting, it works pretty much the same, but the bell doesn't really get a lot narrower. It stays kind of the same as you boost it up. What you get, though, is a difference in the shape of the bell based on the frequency. For example, if you go to the higher frequencies, 6K, you're going to get a narrower bell, and the bell is going to get progressively broader as the frequency gets lower, with the exception of 1.4, where it focuses more on the mid range. If you go back to other values, it continues to broaden the bell depending on what you select. So at 700 hertz, you're getting an extremely broad bell versus 6K, it's the narrowest. Even a small amount of EQ like this can actually lead to kind of a substantial boost, and it's quite easy to make it sound bad. Once you understand how it works, that's where the magic happens and where you can get the most out of this. And just to hone in on what's going on, we can also check out some of the harmonics you get from the Kramer HLS. And I put up a test oscillator. This is like a 1K sine wave. You can see that it's generating a bit of a harmonic right away at the bass default settings. It's quite subtle and it's not always really easy to hear. You really need to kind of know what to listen for. It's a lot more audible if you put this on like a bass synth or something like that, where all of a sudden you're not going to hear distortion, but you're going to hear the bass a little bit more defined, a little bit more focused. And that's the upper harmonic that it's making that lower fundamental easier to hear. and quantifying the mix. So you can boost the amount of harmonics with the preamp, and it kind of changes a little bit depending on your impedance. You can also crank up the input to get even more harmonics. You get to the point that they can get quite audible, saturated, and loud. So let's check out some potential practical applications as well on some instruments. I pull up a drum group, a bass and guitar group from one of my songs, a session that I was working on, just to illustrate what this EQ can do and how it can be useful. In a drum mix, we can use this EQ to gain a little bit more clarity. Let's check it out. It sounds very good, but it could use a little bit more of a mid-range or presence boost to make it cut a little bit more. So first I want to let's try to boost the presence here. It's really nice, but it sounds a little bit too aggressive. So another option would be to change the impedance settings. Way more subtle, but it makes a big difference, especially if you hear the hi-hats and how it makes them a lot more focused and clearer. I also want to get a little bit more roominess, more mid-range presence. So I selected this 1.4 frequency, and I'm going to boost just a little bit of it. And as we saw earlier, that's kind of the narrower band for boosting mid-range. It's bringing out a lot of the room. Now it's too much, but if we back it up just a bit, yeah, I can definitely get more of that knock from the snare and more of the room, which is making the kit feel a bit more alive. So let's check out without the EQ. Very minimal adjustments, but a huge difference in terms of the presence and the clarity of this drum kit. So let's see what we can do to the bass using the same EQ. Cool. This sounds nice, but we can beef it up just a little bit with the 60 hertz setting. I'm just gonna put it on with no boost and see what happens. Already quite a massive difference. We also had some boost at 700 hertz engaged. Let me just remove it. So we can really hear what this 60 hertz shelf is kind of doing. And it's adding a lot of fullness to the low frequency and the low mids of the bass. Back to the mid range, the 700 hertz, it's a great way to bring up some of that throatiness of the bass, some of that attack that it's not clicky, but a lot more of a punchy frequency range. So I want to go quite subtle. I'm getting a lot more string definition without too much clickiness. So let's see if I boost it, what we get. A little goes a long way with this EQ, and this tone shaping is helping us quite a bit in getting a bit more definition and fullness from the bass. We can also try and add some more harmonic saturation. At the highest settings, I feel like it was getting a little bit choked. The transients were getting a bit choked and compressed, but at 30 seems to be like a really nice sweet spot with some added grit. Let's see what we can do instead with our guitars. Okay, I added a little bit of a slope to kind of remove some of the low end. It wasn't particularly subby, but we don't really need any of that for this guitar subgroup. So to give even more headroom to the bass and drums, we can consider cutting out some of those frequencies there. I also boosted some higher mid range to help the guitar cut a bit more through the mix. There's also a bit of a presence boost here, which was quite aggressive on the drum, but actually works really well on guitar. It's, giving us that edge, the extra, the extra attack that we need. This is kind of a cutting guitar sound, and this is helping us cut even more. So let's listen to the instrument groups all together and see what we get. With EQ, without EQ. So the EQ, the way we're using it, it kind of helps us bring more presence forward in the mix. And it almost feels like the saturation brings a small amount of compression to the sound. It's not like traditional dynamic compression, but the saturation kind of helps glue things together in a very invisible way. It's not really audible distortion, but there's definitely some kind of gluing effect going on, which is one of the things I really love about this plugin, and one of the things I think really makes it different from other EQs on the market. You can recreate the curves in many other plugins, but so there you have it, an oldie, but something that is still quite useful, and it made its way into my workflow over the years. If you enjoy this breakdown, I'll do a few more of these videos talking about plugins and how you can make the most of them by learning how they work and how to use them in context. Cheers.